The court is now in session. Before the record advances, it must acknowledge what has already been placed before the jury. Day 2 did not end the siege, it refined it. Windows disappeared, water became leverage, silence became strategy. And somewhere between Lincoln and Fort Stanton, an accusation hardened into justification without ever being tested by distance, angle, or proof. No walls fell on day 2, but restraint did. And so, day 3 enters this court under altered conditions. Not louder, not faster, but longer, farther, and more consequential. Because a siege is not merely an exchange of fire. It is a contest over meaning. It asks not only who can hold a wall, but who can define what that wall represents. Refuge or rebellion, defense or defiance, lawlessness or resistance. And the most dangerous weapon in that contest is not always a rifle. It is distance. Distance between the trigger and the body. Distance between the report and the truth. Distance between a county's authority and a federal uniform's patience. On this day, the battle stretches beyond streets and adobe, into hillsides, into testimony, into federal conscience. Distance becomes a weapon, and neutrality becomes fatal, because distance allows men to act without recognition. It permits the shooter to see a shape instead of a face. It permits the listener, miles away, to accept a story instead of demanding proof. On this morning, a single rifle will speak from so far away that no charge can answer it. A man will fall, not in the street, not in a doorway, but in open land, seen, struck, and then left behind by fear. The court will ask what kind of war leaves its wounded where they lie, and what kind of authority allows that abandonment to become normal. Because abandonment is not an accident in a siege. It is a policy written in instinct. It is what happens when every step into the open becomes a confession that you are willing to die for someone else. And once a man is left on a hillside, alive, paralyzed, and waiting, the siege has declared something it cannot later retract, that it is willing to let suffering do the work that bullets cannot. On this day, federal officers will ride into Lincoln, not to stop the shooting, but to interpret it. They will arrive under the banner of investigation. They will call it inquiry. They will describe themselves as observers. But the court instructs the jury to hear the subtext. An investigation is never neutral when the premise has already been supplied. If the first question is, who fired on a soldier, then the shape of the answer has already narrowed the truth. The inquiry becomes a corridor. It admits certain stories, it rejects others. It does not need to prove the shot's origin beyond doubt, only to decide what is likely enough to carry forward. And in a town under siege, likely is often just another word for convenient, because reports travel faster than bullets, and a report does not have to arc through wind or dust. It does not have to be cited. It only has to be believed. On this day, mercy will attempt to cross the streets under fire and be driven back by it. Doctors will become targets, not because they choose a side, but because the siege has erased the idea that any movement can be innocent. Civilians will bleed into the backyards where no battle was ever meant to be fought. And the court will ask the simplest question that law is required to answer and too often refuses to face. If a home becomes a stronghold, what becomes of the homeowner? If a street becomes a firing lane, what becomes of a child behind the boards? And if authority cannot end the violence, what right does it have to name the violent? Through all of this, the siege will insist on a central truth. Holding a position is not the same as controlling a narrative. The regulators may hold Adobe, the Murphy-Dolan forces may hold numbers, but the institution that holds the power to define the conflict, to decide what is lawful, what is criminal, what is investigated, and what is proven, is beginning to move closer. Billy the Kid will stay alive on this day. So will his enemies, so will the civilians caught between them. But day 3 introduces something the previous days did not fully contain: irreversibility. Shots fired from too far away to argue with. Decisions made by men not willing to intervene, but no longer willing to stay out. Wounds that cannot be undone by apology, affidavit, or retreat. This court will not reveal every outcome in its opening statement, but it will submit this question to the jury at the outset. When violence expands faster than accountability, when investigation replaces justice, and when the distance shields the trigger but not the consequence, who exactly is still in control? Again, listeners, members of the jury, these proceedings resume under altered conditions. Part 8 enters day 3 of the Lincoln battle, not to summarize what has already been argued, but to anticipate what will soon unfold. But to examine the precise moment that when a siege stops being merely contained and begins to extend itself outward. Up to this point, the conflict has remained geographically small and conceptually narrow. Adobe walls, fixed positions, familiar streets. Each side has learned where to stand, where to fire, and when to wait. Violence has been loud, but has remained largely local, bounded by architecture and by habit. Day 3 breaks that containment. Today's scope is deliberate, but it is no longer confined. This court will not issue verdicts in this session. This court will not resolve guilt or innocence. This court will not mistake escalation for clarity. Instead, the record will follow movement, not of men charging the streets, but of force, narrative, and the authority crossing boundaries that were never meant to cross. Because on day 3, the siege begins to operate at a distance, not just physical distance, though that does matter, but institutional distance, moral distance, distance between who fires and who answers, distance between what happens and who decides what it means. We will place before you the facts of a day shaped by separation, distance between rifle and target, distance between accusation and proof, distance between civil disorder and federal response. You will hear how hillsides become killing grounds, not because they are fought over, but because they are ignored once the shot is fired. You will hear how investigators arrive with no authority to stop what they observe, yet still leave with conclusions that matter far more than they admit. And you will hear how civilians who have survived by staying quiet, staying inside, and staying neutral discover that neutrality offers no shelter once lines of fire lengthen beyond streets and into daily life. This episode functions as evidence in proceedings. No final judgments will be rendered, no myths will be affirmed or overturned. Instead, the record will expand again, this time beyond Lincoln's main street, until the siege can be understood, not only as a standoff between armed factions, but as a test of how institutions behave when violence outpaces jurisdiction. Because the central question of day 3 is not who fired first or who fired best. It is this: what does authority do when it cannot control events, but can still control interpretation? You, the jury, are asked to listen not for spectacle, but for process. When the army enters a town without orders to intervene, what does it actually do? When a single shot travels farther than anyone intended, who bears responsibility for where it lands and for what follows? And when doctors and civilians become targets simply by moving through space, what remains of the distinction between battlefield and home? These are not abstract questions. They will be answered in the behavior of men who believe they are acting reasonably under impossible conditions. As always, this court reminds you, legends thrive on outcome. History survives on procedure. A brief matter before the court before testimony begins. If you believe this record deserves careful preservation, if you believe the Old West should be examined rather than just celebrated, your decision to follow, rate, and review this program directly affects whether this work remains visible. Algorithms reward volume. Reviews reward rigor. This court relies on the latter. With that entered, the jury is instructed to set aside conclusions and attend only to evidence. Day 3 will not announce itself loudly. It will reveal itself through distance, delay, and decisions made just out of reach. Decisions whose consequences will arrive long before accountability does. The proceedings will now continue. I enter into evidence. Before dawn on July 17th, 1878, Sheriff George Pepin orders a small detachment away from Lincoln streets and into the margins. Charlie Crawford, known as Lolly Cooler, Lucio Montoya, and 2 additional men, described in the record as pickets or sharpshooters, are sent into the hills south of town. Their purpose is not arrest. It is not negotiation. It is displacement. From elevated ground overlooking Lincoln's rooftops, they are to fire downward into the regulator strongholds. Most immediately, the Montoya house and possibly the McSween house as well. Not to storm them, but to unseat them. The goal is pressure without exposure, attrition without advance, force applied from a direction the siege has not yet fully exploited. This is the siege reaching for altitude. Crawford is not chosen at random. The record consistently identifies him as one of the Seven River faction's most effective riflemen, a man valued for patience, steadiness, and accuracy at distance rather than speed or aggression at close quarters. His reputation is built on elevation and range. He is a specialist in waiting, not in rushing. The men move before first light, climbing into position while Lincoln below remains sealed and inert. No wagons move, no doors open. The town is silent in the way besieged places become silent. Not empty, but braced. From the hills, rooftops flatten into targets. Windows become apertures. The protective geometry of the street dissolves. High ground changes what can be seen, and it also changes what can be hit. I enter into evidence that the rifles carried by Crawford's group are not identified by serial number or manufacturer in surviving accounts. No inventory survives, no affidavit lists a model. What the record does preserve is description. Long-range buffalo guns. Heavy, powerful rifles built expressly for distance shooting. In the 1870s, that description most plausibly points to the Sharps family of rifles, particularly models like the Sharps 1874. Widely known among marksmen as Old Reliable. The court notes the distinction carefully. The record does not prove a specific make. It establishes capability. Sharps rifles of the era were single-shot, falling block, breech-loading weapons designed for precision at extraordinary range. Commonly chambered in large caliber black powder cartridges such as 4570, 4590, 45110, or 5090. These rifles were capable in practiced hands of accurate fire at 500 to 600 yards and competitive target shooting at distances approaching 1,000. They were heavy, they were slow, they punished impatience. Each shot required deliberate loading, careful sight adjustment, and full commitment to the pull of the trigger. These were not weapons for rapid exchange. They were not meant for doorways or for alleys. They were instruments of distance. Such rifles were favored by buffalo hunters and long-range marksmen, men whose task was to kill or compel from beyond immediate retaliation. Elevation amplified their advantage. Silence magnified their authority. A shooter could fire, reload, and observe without reply, secure in the space between himself and consequence. From their hillside position, Crawford and his men fired multiple times. They were firing into the Montano house. The shots were probing rather than precise, meant to provoke movement, return fire, or abandonment, and they received none. No muzzle flashes answered, no bullets replied from below, no figures appear in the windows. This absence is misread. Believing the silence indicates abandonment, that the regulators have slipped away during the night, the sharpshooters rise from cover. They stand. They sling rifles, and they begin to walk downhill towards Lincoln, exposing themselves fully against open ground and the growing light of morning. This moment is not bravado. It's assumption. The hill has done its work. The men believe. Pressure has succeeded. The town is emptying. The siege, they think, is yielding, not to force, but to inevitability. What the record shows instead is a fatal misjudgment. Silence mistaken for absence. Discipline mistaken for retreat. The rifles remain loaded. The houses remain occupied. And distance, once an advantage, has not yet finished speaking. The findings are this. Before dawn on day 3, Murphy-Dolan sharpshooters occupy high ground south of Lincoln to apply long-range pressure on regulator positions. Armed with heavy, long-distance rifles consistent with Buffalo gun class weapons of the era, they fire into the Montano house without drawing response. Interpreting silence as withdrawal, they abandon cover and descend towards town, exposing themselves and establishing the conditions for a decisive, long-range engagement whose consequences will define the day. I enter into evidence that by the morning of Wednesday, July 17, 1878, the siege crosses a threshold it has so far avoided. Until this point, the record shows fear, deprivation, destruction, and accusation, but not death. Windows have been shattered, civilians have been wounded, a U.S. soldier has been claimed as a target, yet no man has been struck down beyond recovery. That condition ends here. Before full dawn, Charlie Crawford, Lucio Montoya, and their companions remain on the south ridge above Lincoln. They have already fired several rounds into the Montano house. The silence that answers them is not absence, it's discipline, but it's misread. Believing the regulars slipped away during the night, the sharpshooters relax. They rise from cover, they stand upright, they begin walking downhill towards the Wortley Hotel and the Murphy-Dolan store, silhouetted against the slope and the thinning darkness. This is not bravado, it's just bad assumption. They move as men who believe the danger is past. I enter into evidence that the Montano house is still occupied. Among those inside is Fernando Herrera, father-in-law to regulators Doc Scurlock and Charlie Bowdry. From either a window or a rear doorway, accounts vary. Herrera observes the figures on the hillside. They are no longer crouched. They are no longer scanning. They are walking. Herrera does not fire immediately. He waits until the targets are unmistakable, and then he decides. Herrera's rifle is described as a heavy long-range Sharps, one of the Buffalo gun class weapons favored by the expert marksmen of the area. Whether the distance is closer to 500 yards or nearer to 900, the court notes this without hesitation. Either distance constitutes an extreme frontier shot. A shot at this range with a period-correct Sharps rifle is not accidental. It is not casual. It requires precise range estimation without optical magnification, careful elevation using iron tang sights, and judgment of wind drift across open ground measured in football fields rather than in feet. This is not modern ballistics. There is no scope. There is no calculator. There is no correction after the fact. The bullet travels slowly by modern standards, following a steep, high-arcing trajectory, what long-range shooters call a rainbow. It remains airborne long enough for wind, humidity, and mirage to act upon it. A misjudgment of wind by even a single mile an hour can move the point of impact by several feet. There is no evidence of ranging shots, no second attempt. The record shows one decision, one pull of the trigger. I enter into evidence that Herrera fires. The report is described as thunderous. The bullet strikes Charlie Crawford through both hips, destroying his spine. He collapses immediately. He cannot move. He does not die at once, but his fate is decided in the instant his body hits the ground. This is the first wound of the siege that cannot be undone. The testimony is this: the men with Crawford do not attempt to rescue. Shocked by the sudden return fire and by the clarity of the precision, they flee downhill towards the safety of the house. Crawford is left behind. He drags himself behind a rock. He remains conscious, and he waits. The sun rises, the heat builds, minutes stretch into hours. No stretcher comes, no flag of truce appears, no shot finishes what has been started. The siege has finally drawn blood and then chosen not to look back. I enter into evidence that inside Lincoln, the morning continues with little visible change. Gunfire resumes in fits and starts. Defenders rotate positions. Inside the McSween house, Billy the Kid and the other regulators maintain their routine, watching windows, checking ammunition, holding fire unless targets present themselves. No charge follows the shot. No breakthrough occurs. Yet the character of the conflict is shifted. The testimony is this: this moment does not escalate the siege by volume of fire. It escalates it by finality. The ridge shot establishes that distance offers no safety, that patience can kill as effectively as aggression, that a single man, visible, exposed, and unprotected, can be removed from the field without warning and without reply. Once the siege produces a wound like this, clean, deliberate, and irreversible, it ceases to be merely a standoff. It becomes a killing ground. The findings are this: during the morning of day 3, a misjudged withdrawal from elevated ground exposes Murphy Dolan sharpshooters to return fire. A single long-range shot from the Matano house strikes and paralyzes Charlie Crawford, inflicting the siege's first mortal wound. Crawford is abandoned on the hillside for hours. No positions change hands, but the nature of the conflict shifts decisively from containment to consequence. I enter into evidence this: before the court proceeds further, the record must be reestablished. Presence of the U.S. Army officers in Lincoln on the morning of July 17th does not originate with the hillside shot alone. That wound accelerates events, but it does not create them. Army's arrival is the end result of a decision chain set in motion the previous day, one shaped less by emergency than by irritation, less by danger than by impatience. This is escalation by accumulation. Sheriff George Pepin and merchant power broker James Dolan confront an immovable fact. The regulators are not breaking. The McSween house remains occupied. The Montano and Ellis positions continue to hold. Gunfire has produced noise, damage, and exhaustion, but nothing close to surrender. At this point, local authority reaches the outer edge of its own capacity. When deputies cannot advance and gunmen cannot intimidate, Pepin and Dolan do not reassess their tactics. They escalate their jurisdiction. Pepin drafts a short note to Nathan Dudley, commander of Fort Staten, requesting the loan of a howitzer, an artillery piece. The stated purpose is restraint. The actual implication is threat. They claim the cannon need not be fired. Its presence alone, they argue, would be enough to force the regulators to surrender. The court notes this distinction carefully. Artillery does not become non-military by remaining silent. The request itself marks a boundary crossed. Dudley refuses. Federal law, commonly understood through the posse comitatus principle, bars the Army from providing military force in a civilian dispute of this kind. Dudley does not equivocate. He will not loan artillery. He will not place a federal weapon in a local feud. But refusal does not equal disengagement. I enter into evidence that at approximately 6:30 p.m., Dudley dispatches Barry Robinson to Lincoln to deliver the refusal in writing, and this act matters. Robinson is not sent as an observer. He is not escorted. He is not warned to remain outside town limits. He is sent alone, in uniform, on official duty. Robinson Ride becomes a hinge upon which jurisdiction turns, and he approaches Lincoln near sundown. And when he does, shots ring out in his direction. Whether aimed at him or merely fired nearby, the effect is the same. His horse is spooked, Robinson is thrown, he remounts and reaches the Wortley Hotel. Inside, he is told by Dolan himself that the shots came from the McSween house. Robinson does not investigate angles. He does not interview opposing witnesses. He does not remain to assess the claim. He completes his delivery and returns to Fort Staten. I enter into evidence of this. What Robinson reports that night is not ambiguity. It is certain. He states plainly that he was fired upon while carrying out official duties as a U.S. soldier. In doing so, the narrative shifts. A local siege has now, by report, produced hostile fire against federal personnel. This is not a matter of property or warrants. It is an insult to uniform. Colonel Dudley reacts with fury. In his view, the distinction between a private feud and federal concern collapses the moment a soldier is engaged. Whether the shot was intentional or misdirected becomes secondary to the principle at stake. That night, Dudley convenes an urgent meeting with Thomas Blair and Post Surgeon Daniel Appel. The conversation is not about sending troops. That option is legally closed. The question becomes subtler and more dangerous. How does the Army enter a town it is not authorized to control? The testimony is this: the solution that they arrive at is procedural rather than tactical. They will not deploy soldiers as a force. They will not announce an intervention. They will not issue orders to stop the fighting. Instead, senior officers will ride into Lincoln personally the following morning, Wednesday, July 17th, to conduct an on-site investigation into the alleged firing on Robinson. It is framed as inquiry. It functions as presence. The Army will not act, but it will see. The evidence is this. This sequence, howitzer request, refusal, messenger dispatch, shooting report, and officer conference, explains why federal officers are on the road to Lincoln as the sun rises on day 3. They are not coming to end the siege, not yet. They are coming to listen, to weigh testimony, to determine whose version of events will travel back to Fort Staten, and eventually beyond it. And in doing so, they introduce a new force into the battle. Not firepower, but interpretation. The findings are this. By the morning of July 17th, the U.S. Army's presence in Lincoln results from a culminative decision chain initiated by local stalemate and accelerated by a reported attack on a federal messenger. No troops are ordered to intervene, but senior officers are en route to conduct an on-site investigation. Federal authority enters the siege, not as enforcement, but as witness, bringing consequences that will extend far beyond the day's gunfire. I enter into evidence that at approximately noon on Wednesday, July 17, 1878, a small U.S. Army delegation rides into Lincoln. George Pernington, Thomas Blair, and Daniel Appel, accompanied by 5 enlisted troopers. Their mandate is narrow by design, to investigate the reported firing on Barry Robinson the previous evening. The setting they enter makes such precision impossible. The testimony is this. Lincoln appears suspended between uses. The main street is empty, not from evacuation, but from calculation. Doors and windows are boarded. Businesses are sealed. Civilians are invisible because visibility has become a liability. Gunfire cracks intermittently from multiple directions, the reports flattening and echoing off adobe walls and timber facades. Every structure has been reduced to one of 3 states: abandoned, occupied by gunmen, or nailed shut with families waiting in darkness. This is not a courthouse. It is not a town square. It is an active battlefield attempting to pretend otherwise. I enter into evidence that the officers proceed anyway. Their inquiry unfolds as a two-stop circuit, efficient, exposed, and constrained by the fact that neither side has ceased firing. Stop 1, the Wortley Hotel. At the west end of town, serving as the headquarters for Sheriff George Pepin and the Murphy Dolan faction. Inside, the officers interview James Dolan and Pepin with several armed associates present, including Jesse Evans, John Beckwith, and Robert Bryant, among others. The physical arrangement matters. Weapons are visible. Support is not subtle. Authority is being performed as much as exercise. The account delivered is unified, rehearsed, and confident. As a group, the Dolan-Pepin men assert that the shots fired at Robinson came from the McSween house. They emphasize proximity, they insist on direction, and present themselves as responsible intermediaries between federal authority and regulator recklessness. They go further. They claim that Robinson approached town. They claim that as Robinson approached town, they shouted warnings toward the McSween position to hold fire, casting themselves not merely as witnesses, but as protectors of the Army's messenger. The narrative does not falter. No dissenting voice interrupts it. No contradiction emerges inside the room. The court notes, a story told in chorus is difficult to question without time, distance, or leverage, none of which are available. So I enter into evidence that the officers then leave the Wortley and proceed east down the embattled street towards the McSween house, the principal regulator's stronghold. This movement itself carries risk. Shots crack as they pass. The delegation is visible, mounted, and exposed. The Army's presence does not pause the battle. It simply moves through it. Inside the McSween house, they interview Alexander McSween and several regulators. The testimony is this. McSween's response is immediate and absolute. He denies categorically that anyone in his house fired on Robinson. He denies knowledge of any intentional shot at a U.S. soldier. He does not hedge. He does not qualify. His denial is framed not as probability, but as absolute fact. The tone is defensive but controlled. The position is uncompromising. The testimony is this. The officers listen under conditions that resist careful listening. They observe shattered plaster, cut beams, sandbagged windows. They note firing angles as best that they can. They consider proximity, line of sight, and the reality that sound behaves unpredictably in a canyon of adobe and wood. No ballistic reconstruction is possible. No controlled reenactment can be attempted. No neutral witness can be produced. When they leave, they carry no written determination, but they do carry an internal judgment. Privately, the delegation concludes that the shots most likely originated from the McSween position. The court emphasizes the standard applied here. Not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not evidentiary certainty, but plausibility under pressure. I enter into evidence that this internal conclusion, unpublished, informal, but decisive, hardens perception. From this moment forward, the Army's working assumption places primary responsibility for endangering federal personnel on the McSween regulator side. This assumption will not publicly be announced, but it will quietly shape tone, trust, and tolerance in the days ahead. The investigation has produced no arrest, but it has produced alignment. As the officers depart the McSween house, new information interrupts the inquiry entirely. A Murphy Dolan sharpshooter, Charlie Lolly Cooler Crawford, lies gravely wounded on the south hillside. He has been there since morning. He is still alive. The investigation stops being about testimony and becomes about exposure. The testimony is this. In this moment, the Army's role shifts, not by order, but by necessity. Having heard both sides, the officers now confront a fact neither faction has resolved. A paralyzed man left under fire because retrieving him is too dangerous. The law has reached the edge of its questions. What follows will test its willingness to act. At midday on day 3, U.S. Army officers conduct a rapid two-stop investigation under active fire, first interviewing the Murphy-Dolan faction at the Wortley Hotel, then the regulators at the McSween house. Despite an emphatic denial from McSween, the officers privately conclude that gunfire likely originated from the regulator position, applying a standard plausibility rather than any kind of certainty. This assessment shapes the Army's posture for the remainder of the battle. The inquiry is immediately interrupted by the discovery of a mortally wounded man on the hillside, shifting federal attention from testimony to extraction. I enter into evidence this. As George Pernington, Thomas Blair, and Daniel Appel depart the McSween house following their interviews, the record introduces a fact that halts inquiry and replaces deliberation with necessity. Charlie Lollycooer Crawford is still alive, and he is still on that hill. The testimony is this. The officers learn that Crawford has lain where he fell since early morning, paralyzed by a long-range rifle shot fired from the Montano house, pinned behind a rock on the south side ridge, exposed to sun, dust, and the slow arrhythmic of blood loss and dehydration. The wound itself is catastrophic, but the court notes that what follows is more revealing than the inquiry. Crawford has not been retrieved. Members of the Murphy-Dolan faction state this openly without embarrassment or disguise. The hillside, they explain, is covered by regulator fire. Any attempt to reach Crawford would risk another long-range shot, another man dropped cleanly, irretrievably at distance. The risk is acknowledged. The decision is accepted. They chose not to even try. I enter into evidence this. The record does not reflect one act of limited mercy. Earlier in the day, Santernina Baca climbed the ridge alone to give Crawford water. He did not attempt extraction. He did not attempt treatment. He could not move a man whose spine had been destroyed. He could only delay death. That mercy, while real, did not alter the outcome or the abandonment that followed. This is the testimony. At this juncture, the Army officers confront a decision that local authority has already resolved by inaction. They could leave Crawford where he lies, citing neutrality. They could order the Dolan faction to retrieve their own, knowing the order would likely be refused. They could withdraw entirely, preserving procedural distance at the cost of a man's life. Each option preserves doctrine. Each option avoids responsibility. Instead, Daniel Appel decides to act. He does not consult orders. He does not wait for authorization from Fort Stanton. He volunteers. Appel will go up the hill himself. The testimony is this. Appel is joined by Thomas Blair and 2 enlisted troopers. George Pernington remains below with the rest of the party, maintaining a rear presence by issuing no command to compel or restrain the effort. This is not a charge. It is not an enforcement action. It is not supported by superior force. It is a medical officer and a line officer stepping into open ground because no one else will. I enter into evidence that the climb itself has already proven lethal. The ridge offers little cover. The path is known. The distance is measured not in yards, but in exposure. As Appel, Blair, and the troopers advance, regulators in the Montoya house open fire. No distinction is made between uniforms and posses. Movement on the hillside is treated as threat by default. Shots crack overhead. Rounds strike dirt and stone. Dust erupts from the slopes. There is no ceasefire. There is no parley. There is only motion. The Army continues upward anyway. The testimony is this. They reach Crawford. He is conscious. He is lucid. He understands his condition. His spine has been destroyed. The medical outcome is no longer in doubt. Pain management is primitive at best. Shock is imminent. Survival depends on removal, not cure. Appel and Blair lift or drag him from behind the rock. There is no stretcher. There is no dignified extraction. There is only speed and balance and the hope that the next shot misses. They begin the descent under scattered fire, carrying Crawford down the same hillside that made him unreachable hours earlier. They reach the Murphy-Dolan house. Only then does the firing cease. I enter into evidence that at this point the Army assumes custody, not as captors and not as peacekeepers, but as the only institution willing to move the wounded man at all. With the interviews concluded and the extraction complete, the military detachment prepares to leave Lincoln. Crawford is transported to Fort Stanton and admitted to the post hospital. Army surgeons examine the wound. Their conclusion is clinical and unanimous. This injury is mortal. There is no chance of recovery. Crawford will die days later, not on the hillside where he fell, but in a military bed under federal care, far from the men who would not retrieve him. Here's the testimony. The court notes the significance of this sequence. The Army does not fire a shot to change the siege. It does not issue an order to halt hostilities. It does not arrest a single man, but it climbs a hill under fire to retrieve a dying combatant abandoned by his own side. In doing so, it crosses a boundary it will later struggle to deny. The findings are these. In the early afternoon of Day 3, U.S. Army officers assume a role local factions refuse. Ascending exposed ground under active fire to retrieve a gravely wounded man. Charlie Crawford is removed from the battlefield and transported to Fort Stanton, where his spinal injury is judged fatal. While the intervention does not end the siege, it establishes a critical precedent. Federal authority is shifted from observation to action, assuming responsibility without issuing control and accepting consequences that it cannot later disclaim. I enter into evidence that after the Army departs Lincoln with Charlie Crawford, the town reverts immediately to its established condition, gunfire. No withdrawal follows the federal presence, no ceasefire is attempted, no authority asserts itself. The afternoon of Wednesday, July 17, 1878, does not introduce a new phase of the battle. It confirms the existing one. Both factions settle back into their positions, and Lincoln resumes its function not as a town, but as a mapped geometry of fields of fire. This is no longer a place, it's a diagram. Here's the testimony. Across the afternoon, witnesses describe hundreds of shots exchanged. An unbroken rhythm of rifle fire punctuated by pauses just long enough to reload, reposition, and reassess angles. The regulators hold fast inside the McSween house, the Montano store, and the Ellis house. Windows have been reduced to narrow firing slits. Doors are braced from within. Furniture, sandbags, trunks, and bedding are stacked deliberately to absorb incoming rounds. These are not improvised defenses anymore. They are systems. Opposite them, the Murphy-Dolan faction answers from the house, the Wortley Hotel, and the Stone Torion. Positions chosen not for flexibility, but for mass. Thick walls, deep interiors, lines of sight measured and memorized. Movement is punished. Stillness survives. The evidence is this. This is not maneuver warfare. No flanking attempts are recorded, no coordinated advances made, neither side attempts to storm the other's position, not because the will is absent, but because the cost is now fully understood. This phase of the siege is attrition against architecture. Bullets do not seek men so much as apertures. Walls take the brunt of the violence. Structures die slowly so people don't have to. Here's the testimony. The limited number of casualties during these hours should not be mistaken for restraint or for mercy. The court finds no evidence of either. The explanation is mechanical. Adobe absorbs energy, sandbags disperse impact, barricades forgive poor angles and rush shots. Men fire, duck, reload, and fire again, exposing little more than a shoulder, a forearm, the brief silhouette of a hat brim. The battlefield rewards patience and it punishes motion, and by day 3, both factions have internalized that lesson. I enter into evidence that inside the McSween house, Billy the Kid and the other regulators remain fixed at their posts. The routine is now ingrained. Rotate firing positions, watch enemy windows, conserve ammunition, respond only when a target presents itself. No sortie is proposed, no breakout is attempted. The defenders are not winning ground. They are denying it. Across the street, Murphy Dolan gunmen reply in kind. Despite their numerical advantage, they are unable or unwilling to convert numbers into decisive pressure against fortified walls. To rush would mean exposure. To exposure would mean repetition of the morning's lesson on the ridge. The siege holds, loudly, wastefully, without resolution. The evidence is this. One notable casualty does emerge from this stalemate. During the afternoon exchange, William Johnson, a gunman aligned with the Seven Rivers Warriors, the faction of the Murphy Dolan side, is struck by rifle fire in his neck. The wound is serious enough to remove him from the fight. Unlike Crawford, Johnson retains mobility. Unlike Ellis, he is not trapped behind walls. He leaves Lincoln under his own power and rides to Fort Staten for treatment by Army surgeons. The injury is not fatal. He survives. Here's the testimony. Johnson's wounding stands out precisely because it is rare. In an afternoon defined by volume, repetition, and noise, it is one of the few shots that finds exposed flesh instead of earth, timber, or plaster. The battlefield has become proficient at preserving life, while exhausting patience, ammunition, and resolve. This is violence without decision, energy without movement, risk carefully rationed. The findings are these. Throughout the afternoon of day 3, sustained gunfire continues across Lincoln with no meaningful tactical shift. Both factions rely on fortified positions, resulting in heavy exchanges but limited casualties. One significant injury occurs when Seven Rivers gunman William Johnson is wounded in the neck and withdraws to Fort Staten for treatment. The siege remains locked in place, intense, entrenched, and unresolved, forming the violent bridge between the day's earlier escalation and the civilian crisis that follows before nightfall. I enter into evidence that shortly before nightfall on Wednesday, July 17th, the siege produces a casualty of a completely different order. Not a man positioned on a ridge, not a rifleman behind sandbags, not someone who has accepted risk as the price of holding ground. A civilian. And this distinction matters, not symbolically, but operationally. Up to this moment, the siege has maintained a grim internal logic. Men who expose themselves to fire are men who have chosen to fight. The walls absorb what the flesh cannot. Risk is negotiated through position. That logic fractures right here. Here's the testimony. Ben Ellis, owner of the Ellis House at the east end of Lincoln, steps into his own backyard to feed his mule. The act is routine. The danger is not. Ellis is not a sworn regulator. He is not a gunman rotating firing ports. He is a resident whose home has been occupied and transformed without meaningful consent into a regulator stronghold by men including Doc Scurlock, John Middleton, Charlie Bowdry, and Frank Coe. Ellis lives inside a military fact he did not create. By stepping outside, he crosses an invisible but absolute boundary that the siege has drawn around ordinary life. Within the geometry of Lincoln's firing lanes, the yard is no longer domestic space, it is contested ground. I enter into evidence that as Ellis bends to tend the mule, a shot rings out from the Murphy Dolan Seven Rivers side. The bullet strikes him in the neck. He falls immediately. Blood follows in volume that requires no medical training to interpret. The wound is catastrophic. Those inside the Ellis house recognize it at once. Without a doctor, Ellis will not survive. The testimony is this: what follows is not strategy, it's reflex. Several regulators rush from cover into the open yard to retrieve him. In doing so, they accept the same risk that has governed every other movement in the siege, but now for a man who did not choose it. The act converts a single shot into a sudden, close-range exchange. Dolan-aligned gunmen fire into the yard. The regulators answer back while dragging Ellis towards the house, firing to suppress rather than to aim. This is not long-range pressure. This is not attrition. This is men exposed at distances where names, not positions, are visible. I enter into evidence that during this brief but violent exchange, Jim Jones, a Seven Rivers gunman, is struck by return fire. His wound is described as slight, enough to mark him, not enough to remove him from the field. Ellis is pulled inside. The door is shut. The firing ebbs. Here's the testimony. Inside the Ellis house, the siege reveals a new arithmetic. Ammunition no longer matters. Position no longer matters. Time does. The bleeding is severe and unrelenting. Those present conclude that Ellis cannot last the night without professional care. This conclusion forces a decision that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. The siege must be crossed, not to fight, but to heal. The decision sets the conditions for the night, but the line has already been crossed. Here's the findings. Before nightfall on day 3, the siege produces its first grave civilian casualty when Ben Ellis is shot in his own yard. Regulators retrieve him under close-range fire, briefly wounding Seven Rivers gunman Jim Jones in the process. This incident marks a decisive collapse of the boundary between combatant and non-combatant, transforming the siege from a contest over position into a crisis of civilian survival. I enter into evidence that night falls on Wednesday, July 17th, and the siege changes character again, not by escalation, but by constraint. Movement becomes rarer. Silence becomes heavier. What matters most is what cannot be moved. Inside the Ellis house, Ben Ellis lies bleeding from a gunshot wound to the neck. The men around him do not require diagnosis to understand the danger. They also understand the clock. Without a doctor, Ellis will not last until morning. Here's the testimony. After the heavier firing of the day subsides, 2 regulators attempt what daylight has made impossible. They do not take to the street. They do not challenge positions. They go low. Slipping from the Ellis house, they move down to the bank of the Rio Bonito and follow the watercourse towards the Tunstall store, using darkness, shadow, and terrain as their protection. This is not bravery, it is calculation shaped by desperation. Inside the store are Dr. Taylor Ely, his family school teacher Susan Gates, and several regulators sheltering there. The message is delivered without drama. Ellis has been shot in the neck and he is bleeding out. Without treatment, he will die. Ely agrees to go. I enter into evidence that the moment he steps outside, the siege reasserts itself. Moonlight exposes movement. Shapes resolve into targets. Men aligned with the Dolan Seven Rivers side spot the figures crossing open ground and fire a sudden volley. The shots do not inquire. They do not discriminate. They answer only motion. Dr. Ely does not argue with rifle fire. He turns and runs back into the store. The 2 regulators retreat with him at full speed. The attempt collapses almost as soon as it begins. Ellis is left without a doctor. Here's the testimony. No second attempt is going to be made that night. The risk is just too high. The routes are too exposed. The siege has reached a point where mercy itself draws fire. Whatever care Ellis receives comes from untrained hands, pressure applied, cloth packed, whispered reassurances offered without conviction. The bleeding slows and resumes. Time continues to work against him. I enter into evidence that after the failed dash, Lincoln settles into a tense quiet. No major exchanges follow. Both factions remain entrenched in their own positions. The regulators in the McSween house, the Tunstall store, the Montano store, and the Ellis house. The Dolan Pepin men in the house, the Wortley Hotel, and the Torion. The lines do not move. The angles remain memorized. The siege pauses, not because it is finished, but because it is spent. Here's the testimony. Within regulator positions, morale remains paradoxically firm. Crawford's fate is known. Ellis's condition is dire. Yet the belief persists that time favors the defenders, that Adobe, patience, and immobility will succeed where numbers have failed. Inside the Ellis house, that belief is tested minute by minute. Night does not resolve the siege. It merely holds it still. The findings are these. On the night of day 3, regulators attempt and fail to secure medical aid for Ben Ellis after a moonlight volley forces Dr. Taylor Ely to retreat. No further assaults occur. Both factions remain entrenched, and the siege settles into a strained stalemate while Ellis survives the night without professional care. His condition unresolved as darkness freezes Lincoln into place. The record now turns deliberately to Billy the Kid, not to elevate him and not to diminish him, but to place him accurately. This is necessary because legend accelerates where records hesitate, and day 3 is precisely the kind of day that the latter myth will compress, exaggerate, or misassign. Day 3 is not the day that Billy becomes the headline. It is the day that he remains exactly where the siege has put him. The testimony is this. All credible accounts place Billy inside the McSween house for the entirety of Wednesday, July 17th. He is there with Alexander McSween, Susan McSween, and fellow regulators including Jim French, Jose Chavez E. Chavez, and Tom O'Falliard. The house is under near constant fire. Windows are shattered and compromised. Interior rooms are rotated in and out of use as angles change and walls fail. Furniture is repositioned. Firing ports are reassigned. Defense is not dramatic. It is procedural. Billy's role is not singular. It is collective. Here's the testimony. Throughout the day, hundreds of shots are exchanged across Lincoln. Billy participates in the general defense of McSween's house, manning loopholes, firing when targets present themselves, conserving ammunition when they do not, watching angles rather than faces. There is no recorded speech, no shouted command, no moment of individual flourish. He does not leave the house. He does not lead a sortie. He does not dictate the day's tempo. He holds. And this matters because it contradicts the latter image of Billy as a figure of constant motion. On day 3, movement is punished. Survival belongs to those who stay still. Here's the evidence. At midday, when the Army delegation, George Pernington, Thomas Blair, Daniel Appel, when they arrive at the McSween house to investigate the alleged firing on Barry Robinson, Billy is present. The questioning is formal, constrained, and brief. The answers are delivered primarily by McSween, who acts as legal and rhetorical shield for the men inside. Billy is not singled out, but he is not invisible. He stands as part of the collective being examined, armed, besieged, and already suspect by virtue of location. In the Army's assessment, proximity itself carries implication. Presence substitutes for proof. Here's the testimony. This moment is subtle but significant. Billy is not accused by name. He is not arrested, yet he is observed, not as a roaming outlaw, but as an embedded element within a fortified resistance that the Army has already begun to view as problematic. From this point forward, Billy is no longer just a participant in a local feud. He is part of a fixed position that federal authority must now account for. So here's the testimony. Equally important is what the record does not show. Billy does not fire the long-range shot that paralyzes Charlie Crawford. That act is attributed specifically to Fernando Herrera in the Montano house. Billy does not rush into the yard to retrieve Ben Ellis. He does not participate in the moonlight attempt to escort Dr. Taylor Ely. He does not appear on the ridge, the riverbank, or in the Tunstall store. The day's most dramatic moments, the extreme range killing shot, the Army's climb under fire, the civilian bleeding in his own backyard, all occur elsewhere. This absence is not an omission, it's just the fact. Here's the testimony. Billy's day 3 is therefore defined not by spectacle but by endurance. He is present at the center of the siege, yet peripheral to the most visible turning points. He is questioned by the Army, but not charged. He is firing, but not credited with the day's decisive shots. He is neither an escalator nor a negotiator. He is becoming something else in the record. Not the lone gunman, not the singular cause, not even the immediate problem, but a fixed element within a fortified situation that institutions now recognize as persistent, inconvenient, and unresolved. This is a quiet transformation, but a consequential one. When Billy stops moving through the story and begins to anchor it, the nature of the pursuit will eventually change. So here's the findings. On day 3 of the Lincoln siege, Billy the Kid remains inside the McSween house for the duration, participating in the defense, present during Army questioning, and subjected to sustained fire. He is not responsible for the day's long-range killing shot, nor is he involved in the civilian rescue efforts elsewhere in town. His role is continuous, but not central to the day's headline events, reflecting a shift in which Billy becomes less a roaming actor and more a fixed component of an entrenched position the conflict increasingly revolves around. I enter into the record. Day 3 does not merely advance the siege, it reconstructs how responsibility will later be assigned. Until this point, the Lincoln conflict remains unstable in its moral geometry. Violence exists, but attribution remains fluid. Shots are exchanged, windows destroyed, civilians displaced, yet no single act has forced the record to harden around a clear fault line. Day 3 changes that. Here's the testimony. The introduction of extreme distance alters not only tactics but accountability. A shot fired from hundreds of yards away cannot be argued with in the moment. It produces no warning, no exchange, no mutual escalation. It leaves only result. Charlie Crawford's wound does not prompt immediate retaliation. It produces abandonment. And abandonment, in the historical record, carries a gravity that gunfire alone does not. From this moment forward, the conflict acquires a body that cannot be moved, explained away, or neutralized by affidavit. Here's the testimony. Equally significant is the Army's method of engagement. Federal officers do not arrive to impose order. They arrive to interpret events already in motion. Their inquiry is constrained by time, danger, and narrative symmetry. Faced with two factions offering mutually exclusive explanations, the officers do not resolve truth. They assign plausibility. That assignment, made under fire without forensic certainty, becomes precedent. It does not end the battle, but it frames its memory. Here's the testimony. Day 3 also introduces the civilian wound into the ledger. Ben Ellis is not shot while advancing, firing, or provoking. He is struck while feeding an animal in his own yard. His inquiry forces a moral compression. The battlefield is no longer abstract, it's domestic. From this point on, any version of the conflict that excludes civilian consequence becomes incomplete by definition. Finally, Day 3 redistributes visibility. Billy the Kid does not dominate the day's violence. He does not author its most consequential shots, yet his continued presence inside the McSween house during Army questioning, during sustained fire, during civilian injury, places him at the center of the structure upon which blame will later be built. not as an initiator and not as an architect, but as a fixture. This distinction will not survive legend, but it survives the record. So here's the findings. Day 3 rewrites the siege by converting action into attribution. Long-range violence, federal observation without intervention, and civilian injury combine to harden later blame structures, privileging plausibility over proof and proximity over causation. From this point forward, responsibility in the Lincoln conflict will be less about who fired first and more about who remained standing when the institutions arrived to take note. I enter into the record that by the close of Day 3, the siege no longer advances by decision. It advances by structure. What has occurred is not escalation in the traditional sense. No new faction has entered the field. No decisive tactical innovation has been introduced. No declaration has altered the formal posture of the conflict. And yet, the range of possible outcomes has narrowed. Here's the testimony. Distance has done its work. The long-range shot on the hillside proves that exposure is fatal, movement is punished, and patience is lethal. The Army's intervention, limited, cautious, and incomplete, confirms that federal authority will observe, extract, and judge, but not yet compel. Civilian injury establishes that time no longer belongs exclusively to the men holding rifles. Each of these developments remains an option. Retreat becomes indistinguishable from surrender. Negotiation becomes indistinguishable from delay, and inaction becomes indistinguishable from consent. By nightfall, both factions are fixed in place, not because they choose to be, but because every alternative now carries greater risk than remaining where they are. The regulators believe endurance favors them. The Dolan Pepin faction believes pressure might increase. The Army believes neutrality can still be maintained if events do not force its hand. These beliefs cannot all remain true. Day 4 does not arrive as an emotional response to loss. It arrives as a mathematical outcome. Once distance governs killing, once federal presence assigns blame without enforcement, once civilians become liabilities rather than bystanders, the siege can no longer unwind. It can only resolve. So the findings are this. By the end of Day 3, the Lincoln siege has reached structural inevitability. The conditions now in place, long-range lethality, institutional observation without intervention, civilian endangerment, and entrenched positions, eliminate any hope of de-escalation as a viable outcome. Day 4 will not begin because tempers flare or courage fails. It will begin because no remaining move avoids consequence. The court will now close the record on Day 3, not because the siege has ended, but because the margin for misunderstanding has. What began as a dispute over authority has become a test of endurance. What began as a siege has become a problem of distance. And what began as a local conflict now carries federal weight without federal resolution. On this day, a man was struck from farther away than argument can reach. On this day, officers arrived not to stop violence, but to catalog it. And on this day, a civilian stepped into his own yard and crossed a line no one announced, but everyone enforced. No verdict was rendered, no truce was offered, no position changed hands. And yet the battlefield shifted all the same, because after Day 3, no one can plausibly claim surprise. No one can claim confusion without risk. No one can claim the next step will be accidental. Distance has spoken. Authority has hesitated. Time has taken sides. Billy the Kid is still alive. So are the men hunting him. And so are the civilians praying that the walls will hold. But the siege is no longer asking whether it will break. Now it's only how. The court reminds the jury of this principle as it recesses. When violence stops being decisive, institutions inherit the burden. When institutions hesitate, consequences choose their own moment. And when every option remaining carries harm, the future does not arrive at escalation. It arrives as necessity. Day 3 ends without resolution, but it does not end without direction. The court will reconvene for Day 4. Members of the jury, this court thanks you for your attention to the record. Day 3 closes without resolution, but not without consequence. The siege still holds. The gunfire still waits, yet something fundamental has shifted. Distance is killed. Civilians have bled. Federal authority has entered the field without assuming control. What remains is not confusion, but inevitability. What you have heard in this session is not legend, and it's not folklore, and it's not inevitability disguised as fate. It is process. It is accumulation. It is the slow, documented conversion of restraint into necessity. Day 3 does not escalate the siege. It clarifies what escalation will cost. Before this court adjourns, several matters must be entered plainly and without embellishment. If the human cost of this history matters to you, if civilians sealed into adobe homes, men left bleeding on hillsides, and lives reduced to footnotes by power and delay deserve remembrance, you may participate in the Adopt a Victim program at www.darkdialogue.com. That program exists to restore names, stories, and dignities to those flattened by myth and by silence. Additional victim essays, source documentation, and extended case material are also maintained at that same place, where the written record continues beyond this courtroom. If you wish to support this work directly and help sustain long-form, evidence-based historical accountability, you may do so at patreon.com/darkdialoguepod, coffee.com/darkdialogue. Each platform supports a different tier of access and preservation. None alter the verdicts. All help keep the record alive. For correspondence, source material, or formal inquiries, the court may be reached at info@darkdialogue.com. If you find value in this proceeding, the court asks one final civic act. Like, share, subscribe, and where available, ring that notification bell. These actions do not serve vanity, they serve visibility. Algorithms bury careful work quickly. Your engagement is how this record remains accessible to future juries. Dark Dialogue is available on all major podcast platforms, alongside our companion programs like Dark Dialogue Main Show, Dark Dialogue Shadow Chat Sessions, Rocky Mountain Reckoning, Distilled, and Unraveled Truths, each continuing the examination of power, violence, and accountability beyond the American frontier. This court will reconvene. Until then, remember, history does not demand belief, it demands attention. Make the guilty face the gallows.